Hey team, let's review the British Civil War. Our first question, what set the stage for revolution in England in the 17th century? So, for a good part of the 17th century, England was not involved much with the European continent. The Civil War combined religious conflict with the struggle of Parliament against the absolute claims of the monarchs. Overall, the Civil War in England was less destructive to life and property than were the religious wars on the continent of Europe. The English began to make their mark on the world in the 17th century. Their small population began to migrate, seeking places to practice religion and peace. About 200,000 Englishmen went to New England, others went to Ireland, specifically Ulster, and the West Indies. By mid-century, the government took direct involvement to build an empire. At the same time, English culture began to coalesce, and Shakespeare and Milton helped define the English language. And so these authors, plus Christopher Wren in architecture and Henry Purcell and Thomas Campion in music, gave the English sufficient pride so that they became less susceptible to French cultural hegemony. Although the English economically trailed the Dutch overall in 1600, they had substantial resources like coal, a highly productive woolen industry, and substantial trade ventures all around Europe and in the East. Next question, what was distinctive about the English Civil War? So, Parliament's victory over King Charles I was unique in that in the countries on the European continent where this also happened, the Holy Roman Empire and Poland, the result was decay and disintegration. In England, parliamentary government proved workable and the state only grew in strength. Its impact on Europe and the world was huge, a successful model of liberalism and a representative government. England had only one parliament and thus did not have the provincial bodies so common on the continent, with two houses, the House of Lords dominated by high-ranking nobles and the House of Commons composed of the gentry, landowners who were usually of common birth and often close to the merchant and urban classes. Relatively few church officials sat in Parliament, and Parliament, in fact, represented the major economic interests in England. What were the chief causes of the English Civil War? There are four of them. First, the monarchy was foreign and out of touch with developments in England. Two, the propertied classes, aristocratic and merchant alike, were well represented in Parliament and were willing to pay taxes in return for political power. Three, the nation was divided along religious lines, which usually coincided with class and politics. And number four, conflicts with the Irish and the Scots set the stage for civil war. Next, what were the chief consequences of the English Civil War? So I'm going to summarize them in a long list, which doesn't sound like a summary, but I promise it is. So, first, we have modern land tenure. We have religious restrictions for office holders, the assertion of parliamentary power over royal prerogative, the establishment of the two major political parties, Whigs and Tories, emigration out of England of the most radical Puritans, mercantilist legislation and the beginnings of British naval supremacy, articulation of radical ideas about property and religion in new sects, establishment of a constitutional monarchy with limitations on the powers of government, and loss of interest in a republican form of government. What were the main events of the English Revolution? Why did parliamentary forces win in England? All right, first, when James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Stuart and an advocate of absolute monarchy and divine right of kings, became King James I of England, conflict with Parliament soon followed. Religion compounded the issue, as many members of Parliament were Calvinists, while the Stuarts supported religious uniformity under the Church of England. Parliament also aimed to preserve customary law against the Tudor prerogative courts, and particularly to secure its right to approve taxes. In 1629, the conflict reached a head when James I's son, Charles I, began an 11-year attempt to rule without Parliament. When the Scots rebelled over the king's efforts to impose the English Book of Common Prayer on Scotland, Charles was obliged to call Parliament into session in order to obtain funds to put down the rebellion. After its initial opposition, he called for new elections, only to find the same men return to office. This Parliament officially sat for the next 20 years, 1640 to 1660, and became known as the Long Parliament. Parliament passed revolutionary legislation which abolished bishops and the royal prerogative courts and made Presbyterianism the established religion of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Within 2 years, open warfare had broken out. Parliament's forces, commonly known as the Roundheads, were quickly on the military ascendancy. The king's forces were defeated in 1646. The parliamentary army, known as the New Model Army, fostered democratic ideas. Oliver Cromwell, an effective commander, soon rose to prominence, and Cromwell argued that the king must be put to death to prevent a counter-revolution. When Parliament balked at this radical act, Cromwell purged it, leaving a, quote, rump that then voted for the king's execution. Charles I was beheaded in 1649. There's that one. And then we have England was declared a republic called a Commonwealth with religious toleration except for Unitarian, atheists, and Roman Catholics. Cromwell had to use military forces against the Irish, who had rebelled against newly settled Protestants, and against the Scots, who became royalists after the execution of their native son. The crushing of the Irish rebellion was accompanied by great brutality and resulted in the scattering of Protestant landlords all over Ireland and the imposition of a hated religious structure. Cromwell successfully pursued mercantilist policies with the Navigation Act of 1651, designed to diminish naval supremacy. Not just naval supremacy, but Dutch naval supremacy. England acquired Jamaica in a war with Spain, and the regime, however, failed to win majority support. A variety of more radical movements arose, all of which were opposed by Cromwell. Levelers called for universal manhood suffrage, a written constitution, and more or else equal representation in Parliament. George Fox established a Society of Friends, the Quakers, which abolished all forms of hierarchy in the church and allowed everyone, even women, equal participation. You can see the illustration on page 167 in your textbook to illustrate this. The Diggers called for the abolition of private property and tried to occupy privately held land. In 1653, Cromwell abolished Parliament and ruled as Lord Protector, placing England under military rule. In effect, England became a Puritan dictatorship. So when Cromwell died in 1658, his son was unable to hold the pieces together, and in 1660 the monarchy was restored to general acclaim. The English turned away from the heavy weight of religious extremism and abandoned radical notions of democracy, some of which took root in the American colonies, where some Puritan leaders sought refuge after the Restoration.